Greetings, everyone. My name is Emmanuel, and I would like to welcome you to our program today. We are continuing with our series on rebuilding a new Africa through decentralization. This topic is very important because under the new covenant, God is not only interested in our salvation, but He is also interested in prospering our nations. This is something that many Christians do not understand. Man is made up of three parts: spirit, soul, and body. Our body needs food, and God is the one who created us, and He wants our nations to prosper. He wants people to prosper, and the institution that He created for the prosperity of His children is the government. The unfortunate thing is that we as believers, we think that it is through the church that we are going to prosper. Yes, giving and receiving is biblical. Yes, giving can result into prosperity, but the institution that is ordained for national transformation and the prosperity of the citizen is the government. You see, the same God who created the church, the institution of the church, is the same God who created government. God is the source of government. He's the one who created us. The Bible tells us in Isaiah chapter 45 that God even chooses unbelievers to be leaders of governments. Paul in the New Testament in Romans chapter 13 tells us that, all powers are ordained of God. The psalmist in Psalm 22 verse 28 says that God is the governor among the nations. Daniel, tells us in Daniel 4:17 that God rules in the kingdom of men. So you see, God is the one who created government, and God ordained that government is responsible for national development and the prosperity of citizens. The church has a role to play. You see, the church, the institution of the church, the family, and the government, all of these institutions, God is the one who created these institutions, and each one has a specific function to perform for the well-being and the welfare of people. So the church has a role to play in our society. The government also has a role, and the role of the government is for the prosperity of the individuals, the prosperity of nations. That is why God, in establishing the new covenant, said to the children of Israel that He was going to save them and to bless their nation. So also, those of us who are in Gentile nations, God has saved us and He wants to bless our nations. That is why today we are talking about how the kingdom concept of government can promote development and prosperity, national prosperity. This is important. The reason why so many Christians are being deceived today is because they put all their focus on the church, that they are going to prosper, through the church. Yes, the church has a major role to play in our prosperity. Paul tells us that in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and in Philippians as well. But the responsibility for our real prosperity is given to the government. That is why we as church people, we have to really pay attention to what our governments are doing. Because if our governments are not doing their jobs very well, we are going to suffer. Even as Christians, no matter how we pray in our churches. Just take, for example, many countries in Africa are poor. As a result of that, many believers are also poor. But these believers are good people. We are all nice people. We want to enjoy life. But because our nations are poor, we cannot. So government is a very important institution that we as church people have to begin to focus our attention on how to transform our nations. You see, many of the problems that we have in the world today is as a result of failed governments. It's as a result of the fact that our leaders are not doing what they are supposed to do. That is why we have so many problems around the world. Many countries around the world, including Africa, is plagued with injustice and all kinds of unrighteousness. Why? Because our governments are not doing their ordained assignment. And one of those assignments is to promote national development and prosperity. So we as Christians, we have to engage our government so that the people in our communities and in our nations will enjoy the blessings that God has endowed in our nations. You see, God is not punishing anybody. God is not causing poverty in nations. Poverty in nations is caused by our leaders. They are the ones who are not implementing the pattern of the form of government that God has given unto us. So today we are looking at how the kingdom concept of government can promote development and national prosperity. See, like I said in the beginning, God is the source of all government. And God gives power and authority to political leaders so that they will implement the right legislations and policies that will usher in prosperity in their various countries. For example, in Africa, we are so blessed. We have mineral resources. We have all kinds of resources in Africa, but yet our people are poor. It's not God. It's as a result of the legislations and the policies that our governments are enacting. That is why most countries in Africa are still poor in spite of the abundant resources that are in our different countries in Africa. Things have to change. That is why this platform is proposing these solutions. We can criticize the government all we want, but we have to start proposing solutions that can bring prosperity and development in our various nations. So, how can the kingdom concept of government promote national development and prosperity? You see, God is just. God is holy. And the Bible tells us in the book of Isaiah, chapter 33, verse 22, that in God is the judge, God is the lawgiver, and God is our king. So in God, you have all authority and all power. Why? Because God is just and his decisions are just. God does not favor the rich or the poor. He judges in righteousness. So that is why in God all the powers dwell. He's a lawgiver, he is a king, and he is our judge. So in God all the powers dwell. And in Matthew, in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 to 20, Jesus came to his disciples and said to them that all power in heaven and on earth has been given unto me. So in Jesus as well, Jesus has all power. He is lawgiver, he is judge, and he is Lord, he is king. So in Jesus dwells all power. So Jesus is the head of God's kingdom. So what is a kingdom? A kingdom is a government. You see, Jesus, what did Adam lose? Adam lost government, the power and authority to rule over creation. So that's the first thing that God established in the Garden of Eden. God established government. So this is very important. You see, and in God dwells all the legislative power, the judicial power, and the executive power, according to Isaiah chapter 33, verse 22. Now, there is a serious issue when God created man. So God had to transfer. We have already established the fact that in God dwells all the power, the legislative power, the executive power, and the judicial power. And we have also seen in the New Testament that Jesus said all power in heaven and on earth has been given unto him. And remember, when Paul was defining the kingdom gospel for us in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul tells us that Jesus reigns. He reigns right now as both Lord and King, and he's a judge. So in Christ also is the fullness of all the executive power, legislative power, and the judicial power. But when God created Adam and Eve, something changed. Instead of God giving Adam and Eve plenary power, that is the legislative power, executive power, and judicial power, God decided to share his power with Adam and Eve. You see, he did not just give his powers to an authority to Adam alone. He gave it to both of them. He gave the power to both of them, Adam and Eve. And he commanded both of them to be fruitful, to multiply, to replenish, to subdue, and to have dominion over his creation. So it was delegated power that God gave to Adam and Eve to have dominion over his creation. So Adam and Eve, they had power and authority to rule the earth on behalf of God. What is that? That is government. What is government? Government is the governing body of a nation. Governing body of a nation that makes laws and enforces laws for the benefit of the citizens. You see, the government makes laws and enforces laws for the benefit of the citizens, and governments have specific functions. For example, governments collect taxes, and governments, also produce goods and services according to the needs of the people. The government also protects the people from domestic and foreign enemies. So the government has specific assignment for the well-being of the people. You see, these assignments were not given to the church. That is why the church is not the institution or body that is responsible for the prosperity of the citizens. Rather, this assignment was given to the government, because it is the government that is responsible for collecting taxes. It's the government that is responsible for meeting the needs of the people according to their preferences. It is the government that is ordained, to satisfy the needs of the people, to protect the people, their property. It is the government that is supposed to seek the welfare of the people. So if our governments are good and they enact good policies and legislations, our nations will prosper. The reason why Africa is lagging behind, the reason why Africa is underdeveloped is not God. It's because of the policies and the legislations that our leaders have been enacting over these past 60 years. That is why Africa is where it is today, because of the form of government and the policies and legislations that our leaders have been enacting. You see, the church have been praying for all these 60 years and nothing has changed. You see, only very few people in our churches have received, the blessings. The majority of the people are still poor. So it is the government that is responsible for the prosperity of the people. Like we said in the beginning, in God dwells all the legislative, executive, and judicial power. Now, when Adam and Eve were placed in the garden, God conferred on them a kingdom. A kingdom is a government. It's a government. A kingdom is a government that is headed or being ruled by a king. So Adam and Eve, they were under the government of God. God is the king. Remember, Adam is the first Adam, and everything was placed under the authority of Adam, and Adam was also under the authority of God. But something happened. Adam disobeyed God, and when Adam disobeyed God, Adam was kicked out of the garden, and Adam lost his power and authority to govern creation. So he lost government. Adam lost government because it was government that God conferred on Adam in the garden. So because of the sin of Adam, man lost his authority and power to reign and rule over creation. That is what we lost. And then the Bible tells us in the book of Daniel that Jesus received a kingdom. And in Matthew, Jesus was born. The reason why Jesus came is to restore back the government. So Jesus came to restore God's government on earth. Jesus came to restore the power and authority for man to reign and rule on earth again. So it is a matter of government. That is what Daniel tells us in Daniel chapter 7 verse 13 and 14, that Jesus received a kingdom. And then in Isaiah chapter 9, Isaiah tells us that on the shoulders of Jesus, Jesus brought a government, a kingdom, a government on earth. So Jesus brought a kingdom, a government on earth, and all those who believe in him, they come under the authority of Jesus, because according to the gospel, Jesus is reigning. Remember, the first Adam, he disobeyed God in the garden. God gave him government, and they disobeyed, so they were kicked out of the garden. They lost their authority to reign and to rule. So Jesus came to restore that authority and dominion and power back to man, so that man can reign and rule over God's creation. But man rules under the government of Jesus. You see, the Bible says that Jesus is the last Adam. You had the first Adam that messed up, and then Jesus came, who is the last Adam. So everything has been placed under the authority of Jesus, because he's the one who has all the authority in heaven and on earth, and we are under his authority. That is why he has transferred powers and authority to us to reign and to rule. You see, so we have to understand the kingdom concept of government as it relates to the promotion of national development and prosperity. Remember, we said that in God dwells all the legislative power, executive power, and the judicial power. But when it came down to man, God did not want man to have all that authority in himself, because man will abuse that authority. Remember, even when God called Moses, God also raised Aaron. So you had Moses, who was a political leader, and then you had Aaron, who was the religious leader. And not only that, power was also given to the elders. Remember the 70 elders that had the same spirit? Moses prayed for them, and the Spirit of God came upon those 70 elders. So you see, the plan of God when it relates to man is that God divides the powers among men, because he knows that the judgment of men are not, righteous. You see, Jesus judges in righteousness. The judgments of Jesus are right. That is why all power is in Christ. The judgment of God is also just. That is why all power is in God. But when it comes to man, man is sometimes biased. Man is sometimes, favors the rich and oppresses the poor. So God, in his divine wisdom, decided to distribute the powers. So power is not just in the hands of one man. When it came down to Moses, God gave him the political leadership, and God gave Aaron also the spiritual leadership, and God also gave the elders. So God divided the powers. And then when the children of Israel, entered the promised land, the powers were divided into three groups. You had the kings, you had the priests, and then you had the prophets. You see how God divided the powers. The powers were divided amongst the priests, the king, and the high and the priests. So those are the three groups, and even the elders also of the people. So there was division of powers and responsibilities and authority among the people of God. God could not concentrate power in the hands of one man, because man can easily abuse, his authority and power against his brothers and sisters. So God has all power, and when it comes to man, he distributed the power. He separated the power, amongst the kings, the prophets, and the high priests. So that is where in Isaiah 33 verse 22, that is where the secular government, they derived this idea of separation of powers and checks and balances. You see, most of the political issues that we have around, the political system that we have in the world today, some of those ideas are from the Bible. And even the American system, Jefferson relied heavily on John Locke. Who was John Locke? John Locke was a Puritan believer. And most of the ideas of America, came from John Locke, Montesquieu, Thomas Hobbes, all those guys, Plato, Socrates, the American founding fathers, they took, good ideas from all of those people. But the Bible played a major role in the formation of the political system in America. So that is why America is highly successful today, because of some biblical principles that they included in their form of government. And one of them is the separation of powers and checks and balances. They got that, they got the inspiration from the Bible. So that is why in America you have, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch. And they also divided their government into the federal government and state government. So you see all these checks and balances, because the founding fathers, Madison and the rest, who is the father of the Constitution, they understood that if one man has all the power, that person is going to abuse his authority, is going to oppress the people. But now, let's come back to Africa. What do we have? You see, America is a federal system. They took some of their ideas from the Bible. They took some of their ideas from Plato, Socrates, John Locke, Montesquieu, and others, Thomas Hobbes. Now, and they have separation of powers. But when you come to Africa, what do we have? We have the centralization of power in the hands of the president. So the president is the almighty ruler. He does what he wants to do in most of our African countries, and nobody can question, our presidents, because they have almost absolute authority and they can do and undo things. That is not the right system for the prosperity of Africa. We do not need a centralized system in Africa. We have discussed a lot how centralization encourages corruption, centralization encourages conflict, centralization encourages marginalization, centralization, encourages bureaucratic inefficiency. So a centralized system means that power and resources are concentrated in the hands of the elite, in the hands of the president. You see, that's a dangerous form of government because man can easily abuse their powers. It is only God that must have or has, the legislative, executive, and judicial powers. When it comes to man, God, in his wisdom, divided the powers. Like we have said, divided the powers among the prophets, the kings, and the priests. But in Africa, we still have certain countries that our presidents have absolute authority. And, they abuse their authority. That's why most African countries are backward. That's why most African countries are underdeveloped. Why? Because of the political system that we have in Africa. The president, because of his almost absolute power, uses his power of appointment and dismissal. The president appoints, for example, in Cameroon, the president appoints the prime minister. The president appoints all the ministers. The president, appoints the justices. The president appoints, those in the Supreme Court, in the Constitutional Court. The president even has a way of influencing the legislative branch. So in a nutshell, it's just the party of the president that controls both the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. You see, so the president has absolute authority. For example, in Cameroon, they have 100 senators. 30 of those senators are appointed by the president. Those are all strategies that the president has devised in order to control legislative powers and to control judicial powers, because he has the power of appointment and dismissal. He can dismiss any of those judges. You see, that is why they kowtow to him. That is why they cannot criticize him. That is why, all the decisions that they make has to favor the government. Why? Because the president controls the legislative branch. The president controls the judicial branch. The president controls all the ministers who are under him. He has the power to appoint them and to dismiss them. So with that, everybody is very careful. How can a country like that? We have seen the biblical pattern where God separates powers so that there will be checks and balances. We have seen the example of America where power is separated between the three branches, and then power is also separated between the federal government and the state governments. But in Africa, most of our presidents, they have all the power, the legislative power, the executive power, and the judicial power. You see, the people in the Senate or the Congress in our nations in Africa, the president can manipulate them because majority of them come from his party, and the laws and legislations that he wants to pass will go through because the other opposition parties, they cannot really challenge the ruling party. Why? Because the ruling party controls the legislative body. The ruling party also controls the judicial system. For example, in Cameroon, when there's an election, the election is conducted and then it is read by the justices. Do you imagine? And the justices are appointed by the president. So do you think they are going to rule against him? That is how, some of our presidents in Africa, they falsify elections in order to stay in power. So a centralized system is not helping African nations. That is why we have to move away from the centralized system of government to a decentralized system of government. The pattern that God has given unto us in the Bible, the pattern where God shares power, he separates power, there is division of power, there is, checks and balances between the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Power must not remain in the hands of one man, because if one person has absolute power, he is going to or she is going to abuse the power. And that is what is happening in most countries in Africa. That is why most countries in Africa are underdeveloped. Most countries in Africa, many people are poor, including the Christians, who don't want to consider this issue about government. The institution of government is very important. You as a Christian, yes, sometimes you can receive your prosperity and your blessing from the church, but the church is not the institution that God has ordained, for national prosperity and development. It is the state. It is the government. That is why we as Christians must be smart. We must know to pressure our governments, for constitutional reforms. But we spend most of our times praying, fasting, giving, and dancing in our churches. That's why most African countries are underdeveloped, and most African people are trying to run away from Africa, and some of them are dying, in the Mediterranean Sea, and some of them have problems in other countries. So, my dear brothers and sisters, the kingdom concept of government is ordained to promote national development and prosperity. So if we want to see prosperity in Africa, our countries have to reject centralization, because centralization concentrates power in the hands of one man, but decentralization separates the powers, divides the powers. There is checks and balances, and when there is checks and balances, the people are able to hold their political leaders accountable, and accountability brings prosperity. You see, electoral accountability is an important process in a democratic society, and that is what helps to bring prosperity in developed nations. But unfortunately, in most African countries, there is no electoral accountability. Why? Because the president has all the powers, and he can do and undo. He can falsify the elections, and people will riot and do things, but nothing will happen. Why? Because he has the military is behind him. He has all the powers. Even his own people in his party cannot criticize him, because he has all the powers. He can dismiss them, and he can appoint other people. So because people don't want to lose their jobs, everybody is afraid. So church people have to understand this dynamic, that centralization is not good for Africa. It is time to reject centralization in favor of a true decentralized system of government that can unleash the prosperity in our countries in Africa. Thank you so much for watching this video. We are going to continue tomorrow. Until tomorrow, bye-bye.